Hi everyone, my name is Patrick Horan, and I am the Chief Operating Officer at the Fiscal Lab on Capitol Hill, an independent think tank created to provide Congress with rigorous, transparent budget and regulatory analysis aimed at addressing America's worsening fiscal outlook. Today I'm joined by Bill Beach, who is the Executive Director of the Fiscal Lab, and today we are here to talk about the crisis regarding the United States and Iran, and specifically the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. And Bill,
Is
you have some experience on crises. You have some experience on looking at what a crisis in the Middle East and specifically the Strait of Hormuz would look like. You want to
yeah,
tell us about that?
yeah, it's just amazing, Patrick. Thanks for your overview. Uh, it is the case. I can say it is the case that I have been one way or another working with the Iran crisis since 2006. it just, I mean,
20 years.
it isn't like this is something that just popped up. I mean, many people will think, well, oh my gosh, when did this start? Well, it started with the Iranian Revolution, 1979. The amity between the United States and Iran and Israel, and many of the other countries around that region really took a nosedive, and there's been increasing and mounting and accelerating problems ever since. Iran became, during that period, a bitter enemy of Iraq. They fought a major war, and then Iran sort of, in my view, devolved or evolved into the mastermind of a world terrorist system involving Hezbollah and the Yemenis and on and on, many other organizations. So I've been working in this area on and off because of those crises since 2006, and I picked that date because that was when we began to simulate the geopolitical and geoeconomic effects of a real crisis involving our oil supplies. And that's what we're here to talk about today, because that's the entirely relevant context. All the oil has to move through the Strait of Hormuz, so that's the junction point. So yeah, I've been working on this a long time, and I hope I don't have to work on it for very much longer. I hope we can resolve this once and for all.
Okay. Before we get into the simulations you've done, can you briefly explain why the Strait of Hormuz is very important? I think most people understand the Strait of Hormuz is on the southern border of Iran. Oil and gas flows from the Persian Gulf outward to the rest of the world, correct?
Right, right. So the Persian Gulf is the source for a lot of our world daily crude oil production. About 20% of all of the shipments of crude oil are produced at refineries. They're mined in the fields and then produced at refineries or loaded onto container ships in the Persian Gulf. If you can imagine the Persian Gulf, it's basically a landlocked gulf with one exit, one little tiny exit, and that's called the Strait of Hormuz. How much oil is produced each day or shipped each day out of the strait? It's about 17 million barrels per day. That constitutes roughly 20% of world oil supplies. So 80 or so container ships. These are ships that hold millions of gallons of oil. Those are the big ships that everyone can remember seeing in pictures. They're just enormous. And they just slog through the strait, either coming in as empty ships or going out as fully cargoed ships. About 80 of those a day. So 17 million barrels, 20% of world oil supply. And that's just one more thing, Pat. And that strait is very narrow. Okay, it at its narrowest point, it's about 11 miles of navigable water. That seems like a lot, but it really isn't very much. If you have a lot of ships going through simultaneously, they have to maintain a maritime standard distance between each other, where there's wash issues and there's potential collision issues, especially as they transit at night. So it is a very difficult strait. It's not the only strait that oil passes through. That's really important to our sort of geopolitical story. The other strait is between Malaysia and Indonesia, and it's a very narrow strait. It's called the Strait of Malacca. So the Asian oil that goes through the Hormuz then goes through another strait, which is the Strait of Malacca, that has been the playground of pirates and terrorists for the past 50 years. So there's really two junction points. We're going to talk about Hormuz mostly today, but that's the other major choke point.
Okay. So a couple things. When we're talking about oil coming out of the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz, that's oil that's used to be refined into gasoline, but it's not just gasoline, right? Oil is used in the creation of a lot of other products, correct?
That's right. Yeah, people are interested oftentimes in knowing, well, how much crude oil constitutes a barrel of oil. It's about 42 imperial gallons. So out of that 42 gallon barrel, about half of it ends up, about 20 gallons of it ends up in the form of consumer gasoline, the kind that you and I would pump into our cars. So it's about half of that. A large portion of the remaining crude oil is then refined into fuel oil to heat homes and businesses, diesel oil for diesel-powered vehicles, largely the trucking industry and some cars. You get some products out of there that are very specialized, like jet fuel, for example. It's a highly specialized form and requires very low sulfur content. Higher sulfur content, you get kerosene, and then ultimately there's a product which is sort of not usable for any kind of power source, but can be used for grease, lubricants, and so forth. So when we think about a barrel of oil, we should think about its many different uses. It's just not gasoline. And so many parts of the economy could be affected by an increase in the price of a barrel of oil.
Right. The most of this oil goes from the Persian Gulf out through the Strait of Hormuz. A lot of it goes then out to Asia, goes through that second strait, the Strait of Malacca. But even though most of that oil is consumed by people in Asia, the crisis in the Strait of Hormuz is relevant for the price of oil across the world, though, and consequently the prices of those other goods too, right?
Great point. So if let's say there's a disruption in the Strait of Hormuz, what happens to oil prices? Well, oil is traded on competitive markets all around the world. These are called spot markets or spot price markets. And then it's measured by two big measurements out of about 15 measurements of crude oil prices. Brent oil price, that's the North Sea price, but it's a universal European price, and West Texas Intermediate Crude, WTI, which is the sort of the northern, southern hemisphere pricing metric. Those two prices will react rapidly to any risk associated with the shipping of oil. So, for example, we have seen in the last several days the price of oil rising by 15 to 20% on these spot price markets. These are where oil is traded, futures contracts are traded, current shipping contracts are traded. And why would the price go up? Because insurance costs more. If there's a risk to a tanker that it might be attacked, or if there's a risk that it has to sit for days and days and days on the Indian Ocean side of the Strait of Hormuz, then the insurance cost for that ship goes up. Also, there's just not as much oil being shipped. And so it becomes more expensive what there is out there that doesn't come through the Gulf because of supply and demand. The demand is high, but the supplies are lower. So that's another reason the price will go up. Fortunately, Pat, we have a fairly large world oversupply of oil right now. So we can burn down that oversupply for many days, but maybe not for many weeks. And then the price will really begin to skyrocket if the Strait of Hormuz remains a contested area between Iran and the United States.
Right. And so since this war has broken out, the Iranians have essentially closed the strait. And the New York Times, I think it was just today's paper has a very interesting graphic showing what traffic looked like both before and after the crisis. You see a lot of little dots representing oil tankers last week, and now the number of dots. It's not zero, but it's far fewer.
Yeah, no, no. The strait is not entirely closed. So one or two or three of these 80 are still getting through, but they're getting through at great risk.
Okay.
Remember, it was yesterday. I believe it was yesterday, the fourth day. We just say the fourth day because somebody might be listening to this in 2 weeks. The fourth day of the war, a tanker caught fire right at the tip of the strait. There is suspicion that the tanker was attacked. Iran has said last night or at the night of the fourth day that any tanker going through is subject to being hit by missile fire. And remember, there is a small submarine fleet that Iran has. We think they have about 6 submarines, and these submarines are largely in the Gulf and right outside of the Gulf, that right outside of the Strait of Hormuz. So there's a real threat that if they sink a single tanker, and that tanker is in some way buoyant, but mostly underwater, that tanker would absolutely close the entire strait. It would just absolutely close. There'd be an enormous oil slick. There'd be a major petrochemical event. Literally that many gallons of oil could be set afire, and the Gulf or the Strait, the waters could actually be burning. So it's a very real threat. As a consequence, spot markets are now pricing oil higher because of the risks involved with that 20% going through the strait.
All right. Okay, so now that we talked a little bit about the Strait of Hormuz, the trade that goes through there, the war thus far, let's talk about these simulations that you did. So you did a few of them. So let's start with the first one, and that has directly to do with Iran, correct?
Yes, I was involved in two war games. These war games are basically simulation exercises that planners go through in order to prepare themselves to react to real-time events. So you want to go through a war game before the real-time event occurs, and you want the war game to be as close to what could happen as possible. So in 2007, Jim Carafano and I, we were both at Heritage at the time. We organized and developed a war game. Dr. Carafano is retired from the Army. He was involved in these kinds of exercises at the National War College here in Washington, D.C. And so he's very familiar with the contents of the war game. I ran all the economics in that game. So what we did, Pat, is we set up a simulation. Okay, so what kind of simulation did we set up? And I'll just sort of presage it. I'll just sort of predict. People will be surprised at how, in 2007, similar to current events, we actually simulated. So the simulation occurred like this. On day one, sanctions were imposed by the United Nations on the nuclear program of Iran. This is back in 2007. On day two, Iran withdrew from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and all the other treaties associated with the prevention of the spread of nuclear weapons. On day three, the United States bombs nuclear facilities in Iran. So we noticed that we kind of accelerated events, but we're just sort of pushing events here. We're saying this is the order of sequence. It could have been a week later, 2 weeks later, but we're saying day three. On day four, Iran closes the Strait of Hormuz, threatens to close the Strait of Hormuz. And on day five, Iran attacks the Ras Al Tanura refining capacity in Saudi Arabia. And on day six, an oil tanker is sunk in the Strait of Hormuz. Now, if some of that sounds familiar to audiences who weren't around in 2007, it's because it has actually happened. We've already had a missile attack on Ras Al Tanura. We have already had a tanker attack, at least we think so, in the Strait of Hormuz. There's been bombing, as we all know, back in June, of the nuclear facility and many nuclear facilities in Iran. So things are very similar here. So on the basis of that, simulation, me and my team at the Center for Data Analysis simulated the economic effects of that series of events. And we came up with some things which I think are also remarkably surprising given the fact that they were done 20 years ago. West Texas Intermediate, we just talked about that. That's the metric used to price oil in the northern and southern hemispheres here on this side of the lake. West Texas Intermediate jumps from $85 per barrel to $150 per barrel. Now, currently, WTI is sitting around $80 per barrel. It's already jumped up from its low of $68 back in the middle of the summer. And we had a big price increase just in the last several days. There's a concept in economics called gross domestic product, and you can talk about it two ways. You can say, well, there's gross domestic product. Then you can say there's inflation-adjusted gross domestic product. That means we're talking about gross domestic product that has been adjusted to take out all inflation. So in our simulation, inflation-adjusted gross domestic product drops here in the United States because of this crisis. It drops by $230 billion in the fourth quarter of the year. This would have meant in the quarter following the beginning of the crisis. Well, what does that mean? If you think about $230 billion drop in 2025 kind of context, that would be a drop of about 0.9%. Now, that may not sound like very much, but it dramatically slows the growth rate, because $230 billion on a real economy today of 24 trillion is, like I say, it's close to 1%. And when you drop that out of the economy, that amount of gross domestic product falls out of the economy because oil prices are higher, production goes down, then that slows the growth rate from a positive growth rate to a negative growth rate for 2025. 6 months after the beginning of the crisis, our simulation back then had 1 million fewer jobs in the U.S. non-farm economy category. So non-farm jobs dropped by 1 million. That's a big drop. Even today, that would be a big drop. And the disposable income of households drops by $372 billion. So it shows, Pat, that just the Strait of Hormuz closing, not going on to say bigger global things, but just closing that has an immediate effect on the U.S. economy. But remember, these effects are also effects on the European economies, on the Asian economies. Everywhere oil is a central part of the production structure, the economy is less vital. Jobs are lost, and households lose their purchasing power.
Wow. And this is before, so you also talk about some mitigating policy changes you could do in response to this, but these are the results without those.
That's right.
Policies.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, the work aim is designed to give planners a portrait of what would happen in the case that they didn't do anything. They just sat, or they were unable to do something, right?
Mm-hmm.
So for this war game, we brought people from government, the military, industry to the Heritage Foundation, and they were then playing roles. Some were in the State Department, some were in the Department of Defense. It wasn't called the Department of War at the time, Defense. Some were in the petroleum industry, and a lot of them were members of Congress. And they took these results, the simulation, the Irani events and so forth, and then the economic data that I've just described. And they said, well, okay, what steps can we take to make the harm to the U.S. economy and the population of the United States less? And so they did a number of things. They first off, they got permission from the International Energy Association to go into the strategic petroleum reserves of the United States and use some of those reserves to supplement. Now, must remember, in 2007, we were not energy independent like we are today.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, but still, today, we probably would want to make that step because that would help lower the price of gasoline, lower the damage to the economy, just by putting some of that petroleum that we have stored up in the Strategic Petroleum Reserve present. There were increased military spending. Increased military spending has a stimulating effect on some parts of the economy. Direct payments to households to compensate them for unemployment, to compensate them for lost income. So a number of steps that you and I are familiar with, many of the people who are listening to this are familiar with, were taken, and then some of the damage was reduced. Instead of losing 1 million jobs, we lost 400,000 jobs. Still there was damage, but it was mitigated.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the message here is, if the circumstances come up again, and I think they are coming up again, there has to be actions taken right now by the Congress, the private sector, the administration to mitigate. Now that of course means that there are fiscal effects, right? There are immediate fiscal effects. And there were in the game. Spending went up. The deficit went up. But back in 2007, we had a lot of capacity for that. We didn't have a big debt. We didn't have a big annual deficit. We had a lot of borrowing power. Financial markets were eagerly buying our treasury bonds. That may not be the case today. So,
Okay. So I was going to say, on one hand, today the United States produces a lot more oil than it did 20 years ago, in large part because of the shale revolution. So that's on the plus side. But on the negative side, we have less fiscal space than we did back then. Is that right?
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
That's exactly the case. And the shale oil has a different mineral content. Some of the products that come from Middle Eastern oil or from Venezuelan oil, which have low sulfur content, cannot be produced by the shale oil. So we actually export a lot of our oil to refineries around the world that can refine products with high sulfur content. So while we say we're energy independent, that's not exactly true. We still import oil for purposes of special product production. And so we're not immune from these. And again, going back to what we said about spot markets, we're not immune at all to price increases. Our West Texas Intermediate is up just as much as Brent crude oil is up today. That is, European prices went up. They take Iranian oil. Mm-hmm. And West Texas is right up there, right next to that price point in Europe. So we are now paying a price right now, even though we're energy independent, in higher prices. I heard this morning that gasoline at the pump is going up in price. And if we're energy independent, that shouldn't be the case, but we're not. We're tied to world pricing markets.
Okay, very interesting. Right, so in your simulation, those results, when there's no policy response, especially, are really sobering. You don't say recession, but it sounds like a recession.
Well, it's hard to say, but you would think that, given the fact many of our recessions since World War II have been started by energy or oil shocks, we could easily come back in and have another one that way. Certainly, if we don't effectively mitigate the crisis. And you worry about that because, well, holy smokes, our international institutions are not quite what they were back 20 years ago. But we did another simulation, and maybe I could talk about that because
Sure.
A year later, we decided we needed to take a look at a bigger worldwide crisis. And so in 2008, we did a war game, which I think the Pentagon and the Naval War College are still using today. So that's what I'm told. And this war game involved the 2007 war game, that is the Strait of Hormuz, but it also involved a sympathetic reaction by Muslim radicals in Indonesia and Malaysia, and the Strait of Malacca is also disrupted. It's not entirely closed, but it's disrupted. So now the Asian economies, India, China, 30% of China's oil comes directly from the Persian Gulf. 1 out of every 3 barrels of oil consumed in that growing economy comes right out of the Persian Gulf. So in this particular simulation, if I could look at my notes, what happened is that the Ras Tanura refinery was just destroyed, and its capacity to produce oil was disrupted for weeks, to the point that 4 million barrels per day of fewer crude and refined products were produced there. And then the Muslim terrorists shut down the Strait of Malacca. That disrupted global supplies to the point of dropping that by 12 million barrels per day. The crisis went on a lot longer, and the effects on the economy were really strong. Crude prices go up by 92% within 3 or 4 days of the start of both closures, so almost doubling in price.
Wow.
And you would think that would be the case, right? Because now the two choke points have been closed for a lot of the movement of crude to centrally growing economies around the non-U.S. or non-North American, South American axis. In the United States, within the first year of the crisis, we had 1.5 million fewer jobs. That's a real blow to job creation. Right now, we're producing just under 2 million jobs per year, maybe even a little bit lower than that, depending upon the path of immigration in this oncoming year. And so a drop of 1.5 million would mean we'd have almost no job creation at all following the onset of the crisis. And we had a big drop in U.S. GDP. It drops by about 170 billion a quarter. It's a 33% drop in the growth of the economy. So even here in 2008, we see the effects on the United States economy from an event which is happening clear on the other side of the world. And the reason why that's happening is that the pricing effects are being transmitted through the international system of price adjustment to U.S. markets, and the U.S. consumer, the U.S. worker, are paying for that.
Okay.
So here's another case, Pat, where, and maybe it's an even more accurate case because it looks like this crisis is globalizing pretty quickly. There was a ship, Iranian warship, sunk on the fifth day in the Indian Ocean. It looks like NATO could be involved. If it metastasizes to a larger conflict, then I think this second simulation is the more accurate one.
Oh, wow. That's. I was kind of down about the effects of the current crisis, but you're telling me there's a good chance it could spread and it could be worse.
Well, and I think that's a prudent recognition if you're a policymaker. You shouldn't assume, oh, well, tomorrow's going to be better than today. You should assume that it's time for us to get our act together, right? I think that's what we're saying here. The Strait of Hormuz simulation, the Strait of Hormuz and Malacca simulation have been used for the past 20 years by the military in their war college and environments to study what kind of posture they should be in should these things occur, because they want to move assets, military assets, in a way that they can mitigate the effects of the attacks. These attacks occur, well, if the military can prevent them or make them less of a problem, that's the military's contribution to mitigation. But others have to mitigate too.
Right.
Lawmakers, policymakers, private sector people, they need to know what to do. And I think that's the central message of our simulations. Even though they were 20 years ago, I think they're highly relevant today. It is important that we act, and we do so prudently. And I think that's one of the contributions the Fiscal Lab can make. We're a lab, where you can simulate reactions. So one of the things that listeners can do, if they're curious about learning more, we have a Fiscal Lab website, www.fiscallab.org, where all of our papers are located. We have some papers involving the deficit and the debt situation, the current financial. We have just finished a major presentation on the outlook and the outlook for the budget and for the economy. These are important documents to contextualize the field of action if you are thinking as a policymaker or just as a citizen about what can we do to mitigate this current and real crisis. This is right on us. It's not theoretical anymore. It's right on our doorstep. So I think that you go to the Fiscal Lab and you'll find some material that you can use, hopefully for the good.
Great. And on that, I have one last question. So we talked about military response to these sorts of crises. We talked about economic policy changes we could do too. You mentioned tapping into the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Any other specific policy changes right now that policymakers could do?
Yes, I think one that we haven't mentioned, and it was very important in both games. Both groups that we called to the foundation to play the game recognized that radical decreases in regulation, at least during the period of the crisis, were really important. And so here we had groups that we balanced between Democrat and Republican, and with free market and not free market. We had a really balanced group, and the balanced groups came out and said, "Oh yeah, you've got to have a temporary suspension in the Clean Air Act provisions. You got to have a temporary suspension in certain regulations dealing with fuel fleet economy, not permanent, just temporary, so that the prices that would otherwise be higher because of those policies drop because of the suspension." And there were other regulatory reactions as well, and even tax policy reactions. So Congress could pass temporary suspensions on certain things, could give emergency relief to businesses, could look at small businesses and say, well, what can we do to make sure that you get through the year? Maybe we'll have a temporary reduction in taxes or a longer period of cost recovery. So we had all these ideas were on the table. It was a very fruitful and open-ended discussion about how we could mitigate the crisis.
Okay, great. Well, I hope policymakers today learn the lessons that you and your colleagues came up with about 20 years ago. All right. Anything else you want to share?
Well, I just want to say I hope they do too.
Yeah, I think we all should.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Pat. I really enjoyed talking about this morning, and I hope I think maybe the right way to close this would be to say, here we are on the 5th day. It would be a perfect outcome if we didn't have a 10th day, and we didn't have to worry about the long-term effects. But I don't think that's a prudent position to be in, right? We should always be thinking about how we should prepare for not the worst case, but a likely case outcome.
Absolutely. All right. That we can call it a day. Thanks so much, Bill.
Thank you very much.